Hello and welcome to another episode of the ViniMark podcast, where we discuss wine science, wine marketing, cellar mastery, and some of the rising or falling trends in the South African wine industry. Now, today we're focusing on a fascinating field of viticulture that perhaps gets less airplay than it should, and that is the area of biosolutions within regenerative agriculture. But because we are talking to Johan Reyneke from Reyneke Wine Estate in the Pokadry Hills in Stellenbosch, we know that things are going to get very philosophical. So while we hope to bring one or two really interesting examples in use of insects or bacteria or animals in viticulture, I'm sure that we're also going to be zooming out and discussing the bigger picture and how regenerative agriculture has a role to play in transforming not just the wine industry, but rather farming in general. Good morning, Johan. Thank you so much for making time to talk to us today.
Hey, Jono. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a privilege.
There's been an increased interest in questions around how does this work? What are these crazy biodynamic solutions? And I was chatting to Carl Schultz the other day, who uses these predatory wasps in vineyards to deal with mealybugs. Do you guys ever share notes about those sorts of things?
We do. It's quite a nice part of the wine industry is we've got more than one study group. Some of them are official with like leaders like Vinpro involved with a small group of farmers who really look at doing things in a regenerative fashion. And then there are informal groups as well. I often just get calls from fellow producers sharing ideas or discussing challenges, because every season is unique and it's not the same challenges every season. So it's very inclusive and collaborative and a nice energy amongst the producers going this way. I just want to clarify that I'm obviously a biodynamic producer and I have been for a long time. But to be fair, there are quite a few routes up this regenerative mountain. The biodynamics is definitely one of them, but also not the only one. There are other routes that other producers also follow with great success.
I was fascinated by the idea that a wasp, like we just discussed, is somehow more effective than this scientific spray technique that's been developed in a lab specifically to kill certain organisms. Can you explain to me how something like that actually works?
When I started out, I was a conventional farmer, and we also used to spray. So what happens is we've got this disease called leaf roll virus, and when it affects the vines, they don't produce chlorophyll sufficiently, and they can't ripen the grapes like they should, and it's incurable, and eventually you have to pull out the vines, and it's basically a disaster all around. And science understands or knows that this virus is being spread through a little insect called the mealybug, and that the mealybugs are often protected by ants. And what we used to do was to go around and spray the ants and spray the mealybugs to stop the disease from spreading. About 3 or 4 years after converting to organics and biodynamics, I noticed a significant drop in mealybug populations in our vineyards. And although this virus is incurable, it kind of stopped the rampant spread of it through the vines. And that was strange because prior to conversion, I was spraying them and trying to keep them at bay, and it wasn't, it was a hard battle. And somehow now that I stopped, they almost kind of upped and left. And then one evening I read an article in Wynboer Technisch, which is like a technical agricultural magazine. And it said that if you want to combat these mealybugs, not only was it a good idea to spray them and control them and the ants that protected them, but there were certain weeds that you also had to remove from your vineyard because these bugs like to overwinter on the roots of these weeds. And a classic example of that would be the dandelion. So I found that fascinating because when you convert from conventional to organic or biodynamic or regenerative, you typically start with a soil that's really hard and compact. Nature somehow sends the right weeds, if I can call them that, to remedy the problem. And they typically have quite strong taproot systems like dandelions. And I looked around the vineyard and it was full of dandelions. And then I thought, my word, maybe that's where all the mealybugs have gone. And I walked in the vineyard and I pulled out a dandelion, and lo and behold, there they sat on the roots. And today, 23 years later, they still sit on those roots. So then the understanding came that, these were weeds, but they were also the habitats of certain insects. And if I used herbicides to remove these weeds, and I destroyed everything else there except the vines, that was the only habitat left for all these pests and insects to go to. And once they moved there, they caused problems. So it was very interesting. So in one sense, science was really beneficial because it by working in its reductive way and really focusing on how stuff works and cause and effect and going down in finer and finer details, it brought all the knowledge that, this virus is problematic for these reasons and it's spread by these insects and this is their behavior patterns and this is where they live and what they do. But by taking a more sort of a regenerative, sustainable approach, you then almost zoom out again and you take a more holistic understanding and view and realize that things are connected and that science has a very important role to play there as well. So the first part is great, but the second part is equally important. With regards to the wasps, I just want to answer your question there. So we also do that these days. So we've got a new farm and we're growing as a business, and you obviously want to sort of preempt the challenges. And there are wasps and ladybirds and all kinds of things that predate on these mealybugs as well. So you don't only have to leave the dandelions in your vineyards, you can actually boost the natural predator populations. But if you think about it, there's like two ways to do it. The one way is you can go every year and buy these insects and release them in your vineyards. The other more long-term self-sufficient strategy is to allow pockets, little islands and hedgerows of biodiversity and endemic and indigenous plants, and even other herbs and things that act as a habitat for these predators to flourish on your farm. And then you only have to release them once, and they can then live in your vineyard and around your vineyard, and you don't have to go and buy them all the time and release them in your vineyard. So that to me is a classic example of the benefit of supporting biodiversity. You become a biodiversity champion, and you do so for the greater good and for the whole world. And the more diverse the ecosystem, the more robust it becomes, and we all benefit from it. But at the same time, you're not only saving from pesticides and things on your farm, but also from continuously buying predatory insects. And so it really goes both ways. It's like you do the right thing and then it comes right back at you, and it helps you as well, which is pretty cool.
I'm fascinated by these ladybugs or wasps or predatory mites that eat other mites. And one of the thoughts is that these creatures then become the dominant predator in that biosphere. And my question is that not upsetting balance anyway? It seems in some senses to be making the same mistakes that people made with fertilizers. Can you talk a little bit about what happens when you, for example, artificially introduce large numbers of predatory wasps into your biosphere?
I think it's a very valid comment that you raise, and it's spot on. I think one must be very careful what one introduces into the natural environment, because it may be a short-term solution but create a long-term problem. And there again, science plays the major part in understanding this. So what I would, for example, be hesitant to do or really research very well before doing so would be to introduce alien species. So I would think long and hard before I brought plants or insects from, let's say, another continent or another country to South Africa, as we've seen so well with the blue gums and the black wattles that do wonderful and thrive in Australia, for example, but they completely take over and destroy our natural environment here. So that is real, and there we need to do proper research. So I would always go and look for insects and things in the local environment. The bottom line is that nature works. It's evolved over a very long period of time. And yes, there are populations that become greater and that become smaller, and there's this ebb and flow of things. It's not constant and it's not fixed, but it's very definitely a better solution to look locally, I would say indigenously, and if you can, even better would be to look for endemic solutions, things that naturally occur in a 5 to 7 kilometer radius. To give you an example, what we try to do is we've got this wonderful lady, and she comes into the wild areas that still exist in the little kloofie here on the farm, and she harvests seeds and takes cuttings of those plants and propagates them and hardens them, and then to create wildlife corridors and hedges and things using those plants rather than buying just indigenous ones from the local nursery or buying other ones as well. But science must definitely come and examine the risk factor, if I can put it this way. And I think it's important that that should happen. But I'd also like to give a bit of confidence that that has been happening. I think if you look at the use of predatory insects for mealybug, it's not like something that happened yesterday. And I think it was well researched and it's been proven to be effective. And we haven't seen any massive explosions of those predatory populations. The last thing I just want to add is that there's always this maxim that one must fall back on, and that is that you get stability through diversity. So the more diverse an ecosystem, the more stable it becomes. And as long as you focus on that principle of really fostering biodiversity, you're making proper strides in the right direction. But it isn't unproblematic. And I think what you've identified is something that people need to acknowledge and need to really consider carefully when employing these kind of strategies.
If you'll allow me just one more question about one of the seemingly quite popular solutions is the use of ladybugs as well to eat aphids and other things. I wondered to what extent a solution like that then creates a problem in the cellar of increased ladybug taint in winemaking. Does that happen, or is there not a correlation there?
So far we haven't noticed any of that at our cellar, but I can imagine if you have, a gazillion insects going into your wine, imagine stink bugs, for example, could be problematic. But again, we sort of seem to manage that through diversity. So what we saw was initially we got more earwigs, and they are quite predatory, and they actually hide in the bunches themselves. And then we got more and more different kinds of insects and ladybirds and all kinds of things. Then, the chickens and the guinea fowls started picking up on this. They all come in and they all kind of create this balance, I suppose. Is it a sterile environment with just grapes? No. But it's also not like a zoo that we're busy fermenting here and trying to make wine of. There's proper checks and balances. It's amazing to see. And then you can use like technical tools. We've got these like sorting tables and they vibrate. Sometimes they are, we use, let's say, ducks in the vineyards to sort out the snails. Or we use chickens and guinea fowl to sort out the weevils, because the weevils are nocturnal and they do the damage at night, and then they hide under the leaf litter during the daytime, and that's where the chickens and the guinea fowl love to get them. But despite that, you still have crawlies and all kinds of interesting things rocking up at cellar. But what we then do is we've got these long sorting tables and they vibrate, and it gives us an opportunity to make sure there are no leaves or unripe grapes or stems or anything like that to get in the wine. But what also happens is that if there is an odd snail or an earwig or a whatever that somehow is still there, they then get literally shook out. And it's awesome to see the chickens. It's like a chicken buffet. They hang around. And as the vibrating table sorts out and shakes off the insects, the chickens come and snack. And they'll return the favor, but later in the day when they leave their fertilizer back in the vineyards for us again.
You do want to talk about animals in the vineyards? My only reason that I've been touching on ladybugs and mites and bacteria that eats mold, et cetera, because that feels like a really low risk entry to this regenerative farming. Whereas putting 100 cows on your farm is an entire business that now needs to be run, but it's also something that needs to be looked after when you don't need them anymore. It's like when you buy a pet, you don't only have a cat when it's sitting purring on your lap, you also have a pet when it's meowing outside your window at 3 a.m. and you have to get up and let it in. And that's one cat, and that drives me crazy. So that's why I've always thought I can see why farmers are intimidated by that. So perhaps let's frame it this way. Can you tell me why farmers who look at this solution of animals in the vineyards as just a bridge too far convince me and them why we're wrong about that?
I studied philosophy, so I get really wary to put right and wrong in boxes. But right for me, for sure. I'd love to talk about that. But I just want to say, it doesn't have to be the cows. It's applicable to insects as well, and to chickens. It's the principle rather than the actual practice. It's a way of understanding, a way of looking at your farm that is the definitive factor here. It really boils down to a mind shift. The cow is just an example of the mind shift, but it's exactly the same. So the insects, for example, we've got this area here next to, not far from where I'm sitting now, and it's a great site for Sauvignon Blanc. High altitude, looks directly at the ocean, beautiful soil, and it's a mixture of Renosterveld and fynbos. So the question would be, why not grub out the Renosterveld and Fynbos and plant some really good Sauvignon Blanc there. I can actually make money by selling the grapes and selling the wine. Now I want to leave the Renosterveld and the Fynbos. Is the only reason because I appreciate nature? And the answer is no, it's not the only reason. There's a very real financial reason why I do it. And the financial reason is that, as we've mentioned before, you get stability through diversity. And if you look at conventional agriculture, it's almost without fail monoculture. If you're looking at organics and biodynamics and sustainable farming and regenerative agriculture, it's typically more diverse, but still it doesn't come close to nature. Nature is way more diverse. So if you leave islands of nature and you can create corridors in your farm to connect these islands, it's a long-term risk mitigation strategy. So it does two things. If you have a problem in one area of your farm, it has to travel through this diversity to get to another area of your farm. It doesn't do so easily. Things don't spread as quickly through your vineyards as they used to. Or if it comes from a neighboring farm, the same principle applies. And so that's like a risk management. It's like people take out insurance. So that's one thing. The other thing is you actually save on pesticide costs. So most farmers buy pesticides every year. We haven't bought a single pesticide in 23 years. That's a lot of money we've saved. And if you think that most of these things are produced in Europe and our currency is just losing strength, it becomes more and more sensible, especially for South African farmers, to create self-sufficient systems where you don't have these very expensive inputs that you have to buy every year to keep on farming. So that's a basic principle. So that would just be plants, and the same would be for the wasps. I full on agree. It's more effective and it's much cheaper. It's actually a no-brainer. And to Carl's point, the only thing I think you can do is if you take a leaf out of Socrates' book, he said if you want to affect change, you must stop fighting the old and you must focus on building the new. So what farmers don't want to hear is that they're wrong or that they're doing things in the wrong way. It just gets people's back up, because yesterday's right is today's wrong. Maybe in 100 years' time or 50 years' time, people look at what I'm doing today and say, the guy was a complete idiot. And it's quite likely, actually, but for now, it seems to work. So what I'm saying is just this. Instead of telling people what they mustn't do, it shows them a positive example of something that works. And that's much greater chance of affecting change and getting people over the line. But just to bring this back to the cows. So what happened was I used to spend like, let's say $100,000 on fertilizer every year. Now I'm talking on a farm that's got about a 2 million rand a year turnover. So that's quite a lot of money. Okay, admittedly that turnover is not entirely just from vines. And you'll understand why a bit later when I talk a bit more about it. But it was still a large chunk of money every year to hand out. And then when I wanted to become an organic farmer, I did so because I wanted to be sustainable. So I understood that, from a biodiversity point of view, the normal fertilizers that we buy and put down on the soil and stuff is not good for the soil health, not for the microbes, not for the fungus. It acidifies the soil, the salts build up in the soil. When it rains, it leaches out and it ends up in the dams and the waterways, and it's not good for the fish and the frogs that live there either. So if money isn't your only drive and you want to be more sustainable, you're going to buy organic fertilizer. And this is typically animal manure that they've composted and pelletized, and it typically costs like 30% more. So now you're spending 130 grand a year on your little farm. And then I came across the work of Alan Savory, and I know he's controversial, and I see George Monbiot and those are locking horns with him all the time. But one of the things that I really loved about him is that they had this question. The question was, nature works and nobody is farming that. So, what can we learn from that? One of the theories he postulated, for better or for worse, was that if you look at nature, you never see plants in isolation. You always see this interaction between plants and animals. And then if you look at the animal kingdom, whether you're looking at, Africa or the Americas or Europe or whatever, there's always this interaction between the herbivores and the predators. So in Africa, it would be like lion or wild dogs or hyena, and let's say buffalo. But the fact is that the presence of the predators forced the herbivores to bunch together to stay safe. And what is observed was that when animals bunch together, they create this type of grazing that he called high density grazing. And they then eat everything in front of them, and they destroy them, and then they leave the manure and the urine behind. And then he said the magic happens under the soil. So you've got this bank of organic matter, or the roots of these plants that have been destroyed, and then the microbe converts them to humus. So when I heard this, I liked it. And the reason why I liked it is because we understand that humus retains moisture better, and it reduces runoff to a great extent. The soil almost becomes like a sponge. And, one of the things of global warming is when it rains harder and for shorter periods of time. And I farm in a hilly area, so it kind of made sense. And then I met Dr. Uwe Hoffmann from Geisenheim University years ago. And he explained to me that there was, according to their research, positive correlation between soil health and plant health. And that if they increased the soil humus levels to 5%, the plants that lived there could increase in their resilience and resistance against disease and water stress and everything by as much as 300%. So what makes this really also super important to me is that organic farming where I live is very different from what it's like in Europe, for example. There they have a lot of humidity and rain, and it's like all fungal disease drama. And here where I live, I just have very, very, very old decomposed granite soils, and they're super low in humus. So in Europe, they would be 2 to 3%. Here where we live, they're like 0.5 to 0.7. So all of these things pointed to, okay, let's try this. Let's just see if we can bring all of these points together. So we mimicked nature. The wild animals or herbivores became an indigenous herd of Nguni, and then the lions and the wild dogs became a tractor battery and a little electrical wire. As soon as we picked the grapes, we would put the Ngunis in the vineyard and we would simulate this high density grazing. They wouldn't eat the leaves because it's like at the end of the growing season and the phenolics are quite high and the leaves are bitter, so they go and browse on whatever is coming up underneath, and then we take them out and then we plant cover crops. But now we get to sow cheap cover crops, because in the past we had to sow legumes to fix nitrogen, and the seeds are more expensive to plant. Now we can get by with oats and rye and triticale, which is like cheap as chips. And a lot of weeds and things that just come up by themselves, and some of the previous things that we've sowed that are coming up by themselves. So as soon as they start taking off and they start growing, we start on one side of the farm with the cows, and then we move them through the entire length of the vineyards. They live in the vineyards, and then every day we just shift them. Once we reach the end of the farm, we start again. And the first year we did it, we could do it like 2 times, and then 3 times, and now we're at like 5 times that we can do it. Everything is recovered. So what has happened is, one is, I don't have to buy any fertilizer anymore. Not 100,000 of conventional fertilizer, not 130 of certified organic fertilizer, like maybe 12,000 rands for the digger loader to just like make the compost of the cellar waste and the cow waste and the kraal. But that's the total cost. And then the gentleman, the herdsman who looks after the animals, he doesn't look after them all day. He has to take them out in the morning and bring them back in the evenings, and end of story. What has also happened is that the cows themselves are fertile, and we get to sell about 70 to 100,000 rands of oxen and heifers out of this herd every year. So now you're looking at north of 200,000 rands every year net gain for our business without going further. The next thing that's happening is that our yield started climbing. So in the area where we live, with Polkadra Hills of Stellenbosch, conventional yields used to be around about 8 tons per hectare. When I converted to organics and biodynamics, it dipped and it went down to 5 or 6. It did so partly because I didn't know what I was doing, and partly because the soil was destroyed from the way I farmed before. Then it climbed and it got back to 8 tons a hectare. And now everybody talks about what a tough season this was. We're pulling off blocks with 10 or 11 tons a hectare. So at like 14,000 rands a ton, which is going rate for conventional grapes where I live, not special prices for organic grapes, over 30 or 40 hectares. You do the math. That is a huge, huge, huge financial gain to the business. So it's diversified our income stream. It's saved our costs. It's taken away the problem of managing cellar waste. It's put money in our pockets. It's made our plants more resilient and robust against global change. It retains the water better when it does fall. And the actual farmers become carbon negative. Not the winery yet, but the farming part. So I get up every day and I know that this farm sequesters carbon, really takes it in from the atmosphere on behalf of everyone else. So, I mean, what's not to like about it, you know? So, okay, should everybody go and put cows in their vineyards? Probably not. But all I'm asking people to do is just think. That really is it. Just think about it and don't do what I say. Like do what you got to do. Figure out your own journey and your own way and think out the box and empower yourself. Break this dependency on consultants and people who sell you stuff all the time that you have to spray and fertilize and everything. I mean, use science by all means, but just like power yourself, man. It's really not that difficult. And if it's insects, it's cool. If it's chickens or ducks, it's cool. If it's cows, it's cool. There must be 100 other things that we haven't even thought of about in this discussion that people can do. That's going to be awesome.
For those at home who don't know Alan Savory, his core idea is actually that more animals on the land in the close quarters will reduce deforestation, for example, or will restore biomass through grass growing, or in your case, will restore biomass in your cover crop, rather than the dominant scientific narrative, which is grazing causes desertification. Animals cause the loss of biomass. Now, you say use science. What do you do about the fact that Savory does get a lot of flack from the scientific community, even though he has case studies on multiple continents showing that his technique works? So what do you say to someone who says, yeah, I want to use science, and science says that Savory and Reinecker are crazy? How do we deal with that?
They mean probably are. No, man. So okay. So I'm not going to drawn into a Savory debate, and the honest reason why is because I don't know enough about his work. But what I can tell you is that if I look at, let's say, animal husbandry in general, cows have been given a really bad rep. But in my honest opinion, I think that bad rep doesn't lie with the cows themselves, but how we have employed them in this industrialized agriculture. If you're going to put them in feedlots, you're going to take them away from their moms, then whatever, I don't know, 9 months old. Now you put them in a feedlot and you give them something like maize, which is really high in protein. This is not suited to their rumen. It may make them grow faster, but they're not going to be healthy for it. Now, because there's all of them living together, you have to put them on these multi-spectrum antibiotics. There's a lot of methane gas released, and that sucks. In my books, at least, I don't dig it. And you also just see the cow as an object, a commodity. It's worth its weight in milk or its weight in meat, and it shouldn't be. It's got an inherent value as well. It's a subject. What I do think is the way we've employed the cows in a high density grazing method has definitely increased our soil carbon. It's saved us a lot of money, and it seems to be good for all the plants, even the fynbos. If you look at the fynbos, for example, there's this idea that it must burn every once in a while. And it's true, it must burn every once in a while, but for two reasons. The one is that some of the seeds need the fire to germinate. But the other reason is that you get certain species that start to dominate. And the fact is that, there are too many fires happening, much more than they did in the past. And every time there's a fire, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. So a constructive use of the cows would be to put them in the fynbos and to really go and destroy all the dominant plants there so the other ones can get an opportunity to grow. Can you do this forever? No. At some point, it will need a bit of fire for germination and stuff like that. But the thing to me about science is that science in itself isn't inherently right or wrong. How it is applied determines its rightness or its wrongness. If you look at the splitting of an atom, for example, it can kill off a gazillion people, or it can provide energy like we can't imagine. And that's the role that science must play. And what sucks is when certain groups, and it could be myself, it can be conventional agriculture, kind of hijack science as if it belongs to their group or their narrative, which it doesn't. It belongs to no one. It just should be applied according to the context and the outcome. And there we need a healthy and a robust debate always. Never stop.
Well, Jan, I've gone dramatically over budget on your time, but I kind of knew it was going to happen because I just love hearing you talk and share your ideas. And you talked earlier about, influencing the people around you. My hope is, first of all, that that is happening around you and that farmers in your neighborhood are slowly growing in bravery, I guess, by watching your example. But I also hope that this conversation today is something that will not only trigger new thoughts in consumers, but in farmers and people in the wine industry who are listening to this, because I think you make a very compelling argument. So thank you so much for your time. And I really look forward to some other excuse that I can make up to talk to you again sometime in the future.
Jono, thank you. Those are kind words, man. Really. And it's nice to get kind words because it makes one feel better and it's necessary also. Look, I'm just doing my best to talk the truth. Obviously, I don't get the full picture, but this is as much as I've got at the moment. And just thank you for what you're doing, for putting it out there and putting all the other messages and all the other good people you're interviewing out there for people to engage with. And you're always welcome. And anybody who listens to this podcast and wants to take it further, please do. And I'm also ready to grow and to learn as a person. It's what makes life beautiful.
We've reached the end of another episode of the ViniMark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.